It's a great pleasure for me to introduce the introducer of our award this year, the Ruth Patrick Award for Environmental Problem Solving. In 1998, the board initiated the Ruth Patrick Award to honor outstanding research by a scientist in the application of basic aquatic science principles to the identification, analysis, and/or solution of important environmental problems. The emphasis in selection is given to aquatic scientists who have made either sustained contributions or a single but critical contribution towards solving an environmental problem. And in this year's case, I think it's both, actually. We've had some very illustrious awardees in the past who are listed up on this slide. It is a real pleasure for me to introduce Don Scavia, who's going to introduce Nancy Rabalais. It's a pleasure also for me that I count Nancy as a friend, and I hope she won't tell stories about the nitrogen that we send her from Iowa. Oh dear, 2 stories, sorry. Anyway, Don, would you introduce Nancy, please?
Thanks, John. Are you going to put the slides up, or do I do that? I can do that. We were talking earlier and realized that it's kind of hard to introduce Nancy since probably half of the people in this room could actually do that. In the description of her, the citation in the brochure, Don Bosch referred to her as a tireless scientific citizen, and I'm not sure many of you have seen her taking 40 winks at the Winkler. But it's a great pleasure to introduce Nancy as the Ruth Patrick Award winner this year. I've known Nancy for almost 20 years now, from 3 different perspectives. First, as a person who funded her work, and during that period she really liked me. Then as a colleague working on the hypoxia assessment that led to the action plan for dealing with the hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, and during that era she tolerated me. And now that I've gone to academia and I compete with her for funds, I'm not sure I like her anymore. So Nancy, as most of you know, is the executive director and professor at the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, where she started as a postdoc in the 80s after receiving her PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, and where she continues a really highly productive career. She's a AAAS fellow, past president of the Estuarine Research Federation, an associate of the National Academy of Sciences, and past chair of the Academy's Ocean Studies Board. She received the 2002 Ketchum Award for coastal research from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and several other research and environmental awards, the most recent of which is the Clark Prize from the National Water Research Institute. I want to read a quote from Bosch's citation, which is really kind of interesting and important. As chair of the Ocean Studies Board, Nancy was the first woman chair, and the first chair not from a major oceanographic institution. So Nancy not only broke glass ceilings based on not only on gender, but also on geography, institutional status, and salinity. Well, in the tradition of Ruth Patrick, Nancy's achieved outstanding accomplishments in the application of diverse scientific principles to identify, assess, and to seek solutions to significant environmental problems. And like Dr. Patrick, Nancy works in what Donald Stokes has talked about as Pasteur's quadrant. And what I want to just briefly show you here is he sort of described the old paradigm of research, where it's basic research feeds to applied research, feeds to development, feeds to application, is really a worn out and old paradigm for research. And a better way to think about research is to put it inside a matrix and to think about the motivation for the research. In the matrix, one of the dimensions is to look at its consideration of use, and the other dimension is to ask whether it's a quest for fundamental understanding. And he put 2 of these quadrants, named them. If you're seeking fundamental understanding and not really concerned about its use, he calls that Bohr's quadrant for obvious reason. And if you're not necessarily looking for fundamental understanding, but you really are worried about its use, he calls that Edison's quadrant, also for obvious reasons. Then he named this one Pasteur's quadrant, where you're doing fundamental research, but it's also motivated by its use. That's where Ruth Patrick was. That's where Nancy Rabalais is right now. And I think it's important for all of us to keep in mind, especially the younger scientists in the audience, that Nancy and Ruth and others like them demonstrate to us that you can be scholarly and useful at the same time. Well, working in Pasteur's quadrant is not without its dangers. You bring your science to the masses and to people who need to use that information. And Nancy did that in places, in working on the Gulf hypoxia problem in places like Des Moines, Iowa, and St. Louis, and places in the Corn Belt. And she was met with lots of anger in many cases, lots of arguments. And it was wonderful to watch Nancy with great grace and in intelligence and scholarliness throughout the whole process. It was wonderful to watch her sort of push them back very carefully and gently over lots of years. First, they were saying, well, you know, hypoxia is just a natural phenomenon. There's lots of dead zones in the world's oceans, and this is not due to people at all. So after a while, Nancy convinced them, well, yes, it is caused by anthropogenic sources. And they said, well, okay, but it's not nitrogen. I mean, it's really something else. It's carbon coming off the system. It's phosphorus. And she gently pushed back and showed more information through her education campaign, and eventually told them, well, okay, it is nitrogen, but it's not our nitrogen. And then she pushed back further. And so finally now, I think most people are admitting, yes, it is their nitrogen. And what they're saying now is, of course, we're already doing everything we possibly could do to fix the problem. So there's still plenty of work to do. But most of those arguments were sort of scholarly, even in a tense sort of way. But not all of the problems she ran into were in fact scholarly. I have an example. Michael Fomento, who's a right-wing blogger and commentary, wrote a really scathing attack on Nancy and some of the other people associated with that at a time when there were some shark attacks in the region. And Nancy kind of casually mentioned, well, you know, changes in oxygen levels or maybe pushing sharks into places where they don't normally go. And he wrote this scathing article. And I want to just quote something here from that, which is sort of interesting. This is done in 2004. He said, but as 9/11 fades from memory, shark attack stories are back with a twist. The media have combined them with another bit of nonsense it consistently promotes with the ominous name of the dead zone. Shark attacks and a dead zone, oh my. Good thing it's all a fish story. Then he goes on and sort of attacks the whole idea as a hoax, and it's all a bunch of nonsense to him. But when he ends it this way, he says, but who knows what would happen under a Kerry administration? Nancy Rabalais as EPA administrator? The imagination swims. So, how well do you know Barack? Well, Nancy, the job, as you know, is not over. We're continuing to grow more and more corn in the Midwest, produce more corn-based ethanol, producing more nitrogen flowing down the system. And if you read the paper just a couple of days ago, you will have learned that the U.S. corn growers have actually beaten down the UN food aid program so that they're going to continue to grow more corn for putting in our gas tanks as opposed to putting in the stomachs of starved people. So there's a lot of work left to do. Well, Nancy, in your statement, you talked about wanting to live to be 100. Just like Ruth Patrick. And I have to tell you, we all hope you do live to be 100 because unfortunately it may take that long. Nancy.
Payback can sometimes be really horrible.
So Nancy, on behalf of ASLO, it's my great honor to award you with the Ruth Patrick Award for Environmental Problem Solving. And the citation reads, in recognition of her unwavering commitment to creating a broad understanding of the dramatic expanse of coastal hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, and for her courageous struggle toward implementation of policies to reduce the size and effects of hypoxia. Congratulations, Nancy.
Thanks. It's a real honor.
Great.
All right, thank you. I shouldn't talk to Don Scavia before he gives a talk about me because I did mention something about trying to do some Photoshop to see what I would look like when I was 100 years old. And there you go. Let me see. I've got it. I have it. I have it. Okay. Well, ASLO, thank you very much for this honor. And as my title indicates, I would like to live to be 100 years old. Ruth Patrick turned 100 in November of last year. And she has seen over her years a dramatic change in environmental awareness and was a great contributor to that, which is why this award is named after her. I'd also like to be 100 years old to see if anything I've been doing over this long, continuous project has made any difference. And after talking to John Downing a little while ago about the slug of water that's coming down from Ohio with all the excess nitrate this year and already having had a record year flood on the Mississippi, it's just an indication of how the system and vagaries of climate and economics drive this system maybe a whole lot more than just the biology and the physics. So I wanted to have a sort of a parallel discussion of my time in the hypoxia business and the environmental awareness, the science advocacy that's been a parallel track since I began this. Let me see. So these are the prior recipients of the Ruth Patrick Award, and a picture of her there as well. I do remember hearing Dave Schindler give his receiving the award at ASLO 2005, and he talked about some of the same things that Don just talked about, being maligned by the press, policy, people, anybody could get their hands on him, I think, at the time. Even some somewhat dangerous situations. Now, I do wear a flak jacket when I go to the Midwest, but there's also this big bullseye painted on my back as well that, kind of makes, the yin and yang of it. But I thought that Dave was, I thought to myself that, I can't believe some of the things they've done to him and said about him. And as you just heard, Michael Fumento with the New York Post has had his stab at me. Shortly after Gene Turner and I won an award that carried some money with it, Forbes magazine called us the environmental darlings of hypoxia, or something like that. I've heard that in some meetings with agribusiness and other such people that my friends have said that they have said some things about me that they won't even tell me they've said. So my imagination is rampant right now, but maybe they'll tell me someday when I've had a couple of bottles of wine. So I've been at this for about 25 years. I hope to keep going a long, long time longer. And the goal of our research problems is to basic understanding of the issue, but also to transfer and translate that information so that it can be used in the public arena in policy making. I'm a very strong believer that all the research I do needs to be translated in some way so that people, perhaps other than reading a science journal, can have the benefit of it as well as our scientific public. And over the years, of course, I haven't done this alone. In this array of photographs are some of the people that I've published the most with. Gene Turner, of course, my husband and colleague and collaborator on our best reprint, which is Emily Catherine Hanna Turner. And other people like Brune Sengupta, Dubravko Justic, Bill Wiseman, Quay Dortch, and then a series of Dons on the right. Don Harper, who has done a lot of benthic work with me, Don Scavia, and Don Bosch, who have always been behind me, helping me, encouraging me, pushing me sometimes, while they stand back and let me take the flak. Not really. But a lot of people have been involved in this research over the years. So what I'd like to do is kind of go through this diagram of how some of these things might happen. Don showed the matrix, but I've taken something that we published once, which is in the lower part of the diagram, the circle. But what drives all of this to start with is maybe scientific curiosity or hypothesis testing. In the case of Louisiana and the low oxygen zone offshore, Don Bosch, the director at the time, There had been reports of it previously. He was from the Chesapeake Bay. We knew the nitrate was going up in the Mississippi River, and so put two and two together and probably come up with a bigger problem than the number 4. So he got some money from NOAA through the help of our senator, John Breaux, and we began doing this work, trying to map and assess, see what the relationships were with the physics and biology. And that led into some more directed research programs. Of course, at the time, the management need was not known or was not want to be known. So a lot of the management needs didn't actually drive the directed research program until a little bit later. And then, so hopefully this directed research program comes up with good, solid evidence and can make a change, especially when you want to start implementing management strategy. And there was a lot of people involved, stakeholders, and the always facilitator who is at these conferences, keeping us all straight, that develop some sorts of management plans that can be revised with more data, more modeling, and improved over time. Whether or not they're improved over time is not always clear, as I'll point out later. So without spending a lot of time discussing the hypoxia issue, although many of you know I can talk about this for hours on end, I just want to tell you something about the issue. The Mississippi River watershed is huge. It covers about 41% of the lower 48 states. It's primarily agricultural watershed with some forests and some pasture lands and, of course, cities and industries and all of the nutrient pollution that derives from them. Most of the wetlands have been lost. The river's been channelized. The system is just not what it was in the early 1800s when human settlers, European-based human settlers, started moving across the landscape. And at the terminus of this large area is an area of hypoxia or low oxygen, commonly called the dead zone in the public, in the press, that covers a large area up to the size of the state of Massachusetts. And I think Don Bosch kidded me one year that I was after the size of the state of Maryland, but we're not up there yet. So the basic process is, of course, the Mississippi River brings a lot of fresh water. That fresh water sets up a stratified coastal system, and it remains stratified for most of the year, primarily from the salinity, as opposed to a lake system, which would become stratified in the summer because of temperature differences. The stratification is strengthened in the summer by thermal warming from sunlight, and also the frequency of cold fronts starts to drop, and the water stabilizes and is stabilized for a much longer period so that the respiration processes in the bottom waters can become established. So also with this river water, with the sediments, are huge quantities of dissolved inorganic nitrogen, phosphorus, and organic nitrogen and phosphorus as well, that are used by the phytoplankton, which are otherwise limited by nitrogen for their growth. So the excess nitrogen leads to more production of phytoplankton, which ends up as senescent cells on the bottom or in zooplankton fecal pellets or in marine aggregates. But about half of the production in the surface waters does get to the bottom sediments and the lower layer. And the decomposition of that by aerobic bacteria drives down the oxygen concentration, and there's little resupply across the picnic line when it's so strong. So the area on the Louisiana shelf for reference, the city of New Orleans is right here. The Mississippi River is here. Further up off the map, about a third of the flow of the Mississippi is diverted into the Atchafalaya spillway, and it comes out here. So more than half of the discharge from the Birdfoot Delta moves to the west, and most of the Atchafalaya, of course, moves to the west. The peak time for discharge is in the spring. That's also when the nitrate concentration is higher, and that leads to the biological production that is so important on this shelf because it also supports a huge and important food web in commercial fisheries. But the amount of nitrogen that reaches the area now is much more than it has been in the past, and past sufficiency for supporting the food web. This is a true color MODIS image, and it shows the sediment. What you can't see are the dissolved nutrients, which move a whole lot farther downstream and are taken up and regenerated several times in that process. So for most of the year, the water moves from the east to the west, and especially during the flood period in the spring, there's a reversal of currents in the summer that push a lot of that fresh water back onto the shelf and moves some of it to the east. The Atchafalaya water influence can be seen to the east, and you also can see fresher water under flood conditions off of Mississippi. So let's see. The result is a large area of low oxygen. This is the map from 2007. From the Mississippi River Delta all the way over to the Texas coast and into Texas. I have a Texas passport, so I'm allowed to go into Texas. And just don't let those Aggies come into the Louisiana waters, though. As an aside, some of the fallacies that are always thrown at me that I have to keep pushing back. Somebody said once that it's obvious the Mississippi River is not related to hypoxia because there's no hypoxia right next to the Mississippi River, excuse me. But we don't also have any stations over there, but because it's really turbid and you have to weigh how long you can be out there and how much area you can cover with the amount of money that you have, and to get the boat back in time before you turn into a pumpkin, because they're pretty tightly scheduled. But it can be large, up to 22,000 square kilometers. From very near shore, as close as I'll be able to take the boat without the captain getting upset at me. We do have some pretty shallow stations, especially in this area off the Atchafalaya right here. And so from very shallow depths right near shore, usually more like 5 meters depths, out to, at a maximum so far, I've measured 60 meters depth, mostly in 5 to 35, 40 meters offshore, depth offshore. So over the years we've done this, beginning in 1985. We have the same grid. We've had to add stations because the area has grown. But one of the other things that gets thrown up at me that I have to, explain, that I've been accused of adding more and more stations so that the hypoxia can be getting bigger and bigger. But the purpose of every cruise is to outline the area as best as possible, and usually we don't even get finished sometimes, so the areas actually could be larger than what we estimate. It's an estimate. It's a 5-day quasi-synoptic cruise estimate, although now it's taking up to 7 days to map the area. You can see the Ds for droughts. There was a midsummer drought in 1988, so no stratification, and the hypoxia that started to develop dissipated. The drought in 2000 was a spring drought, so less nutrients, less carbon reaching the bottom, but sufficient water in the summer for stratification and development of hypoxia. And hurricanes are the best. I wish I had one of those egg mixers that was in yesterday's talks, because the hurricanes, besides mixing up the water column, re-aerate the water, but they also do a lot of other damage in the process. So, and on here is the 5,000 square kilometers mark, which is a goal for the action plan, which we'll talk about later. The main driver in this system is the nitrogen that's delivered by the Mississippi River, and I'll talk about that too. So why do we care? Well, there are large areas on the offshore area that do not have any demersal species, shown here croaker, shown here croaker move mostly offshore, the brown shrimp move inshore. So if you consider an area the size of the state of Maryland or New Jersey, or, well, it's not Maryland yet, sorry, Massachusetts, New Jersey, then that's a large area for a commercial trawler not to catch anything for a month or so in the summer. And the implications for the fisheries are pretty obvious to most of the people who trawl out there. These areas also block the migration of juvenile shrimp from the inshore to the offshore, and that's lost secondary production. There are direct mortalities of organisms when these low oxygen masses come onto the shore, and you have massive fish kills. That's not that often, but it does occur. And then there are the poor animals that live in the benthos, which John Downing, in a review of our book in ASLO in 2002, called charismatically stressed or dead organisms, because I didn't have anything fuzzy and furry, but he thinks they're charismatic, so He also liked the book, which was good. So benthic organisms die off. There's loss of biodiversity of taxa, not just species. The biomass is very small. It's an opportunistic sort of benthic community, and it doesn't recover necessarily in the fall when the low oxygen conditions abate. And if it's been a really severe summer, the recruitment the following spring is not as good as it could be. So we've been doing this for a long time. We take these shelf-wide surveys in midsummer. They're expensive propositions, which is why we only do one. I'll have to talk to Don's successors at NOAA about maybe getting some more money for this, but they know the issue. We're developing a monitoring plan right now. We also go out monthly on the Transect Sea off of Terrebonne Bay, which is near the location of my laboratory, and we started in 2000 picking up a transect off of the Atchafalaya because of the differences in the receiving environment, the differences in the nutrients delivered, and it was a perfect ecosystem level experiment for us to start, so we've started doing that. And then at 2 stations right now we have, thank goodness for oil platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. They make perfect places for coastal ocean observing systems. And we work with LSU. We have full MET package and all kinds of things. And then we also have our oxygen meters. So we have 2 of those up and running right now. We spend a lot of time in the field. The lovely building in the upper left is the Marine Lab in Cocodrie, Lumcon. You're welcome to come down there sometime. I'm also always looking for volunteers to go out on a nice ship, the Pelican, to do the things that we do. And in fact, I think I might start charging people as like an elder hostel or a vacation. They can come, help us take samples and feel good about it, and then I can supplement my boat budget. So besides all the measurements that we make, we've also gone into historic data, shown here, again, the fact that half of the carbon gets to the bottom. And there was a Louisiana offshore oil port pre-assessment that started in the 1970s that actually measured oxygen over a long time series until 1995. So our data started in 1985. And this provides a much longer data set that shows in 2 stations in less than and greater than 10 meters, a general decline over time in the oxygen. So that's real data. That's measured data, but we don't have a lot of measured data to take us back any further. So we've been doing a lot of paleo indicator work, similar to what Elizabeth Canuel talked about in the plenary this morning, but not to the detail, not doing those sorts of markers in our study area. But we have lots of evidence from foraminiferans, which are here, and changes in the ratios of those that can tolerate low oxygen versus those that can't, and that ratio getting larger over the year. Some foraminifera, like quinquinoculina in the bottom right, used to be very common and is not common. It's not found at all anymore, and it's a hypoxia intolerant species. The Delta C13 shows that the increased accumulation in carbon has been marine in situ phytoplankton production, and it's increased. The diatoms increase the remains biogenic silica, and actual genera, it's obvious that they've increased over time. So there's a lot of evidence for increased productivity, a lot of evidence for worsening hypoxia with changes mostly in the 1950s and especially since the 1970s. And also evidence that hypoxia is not a common phenomena or not a natural phenomenon for this shelf, but that has been aggravated by human activities. The changes in the nutrients, nitrate has tripled in its load since the early 1970s, and you can see that increase in the upper right here. And we didn't start getting total nitrogen until in the middle of the 70s, but the nitrate is usually about 2/3 of the total nitrogen. It's fairly consistent, and it's gone, obviously it's increased. 2 different groups of people have looked at this increase in load and using 2 different methods, and they both come to the conclusion that 80% of the change in this total load is due to the concentration of the nitrate, and only 20% of this change is due to changes in discharge. But you can also see that over this time period from the early 70s to present, while there's a lot of variability in discharge, there's not a trend, not an obvious trend. So Dubrovko-Justick, we all realized very early that the amount of nitrate that comes down the river is really important in determining the size of hypoxia. So I just keep adding circles to this graph. It gets better and better. Dubrovko integrated over 75 days prior to the cruise, and I'll show you a different model later, but hurricane years end up with less hypoxia than predicted for obvious reasons, and it depends on the storm, how quickly it moves, how big it is, how intense the barometric pressure is, whether it just makes a difference, but it does knock back the size of the hypoxia. So Turner's taken these data and looked at all kinds of combinations of discharge, phosphate, total phosphorus, total nitrogen, nitrate, nutrient ratios, and everything that everybody says is most important in determining hypoxia, and the one that comes out the most important is nitrate. The nitrate flux in May of the year that the mapping is done, plus there's a year term in there which is verified with biogenic silica and carbon accumulation in the sediments. So as you can see, we only have data. He's extrapolated these data based on that other long-term data set. But you can see by this model that hypoxia was not a large-scale phenomenon on the shelf, according to this model, and also according to our paleo indicators. This has been verified by other models. This is the Turner. Scavia has a model that's based on nitrate, but with some decay through time, a distance basically, but no low oxygen of substance prior to the early 1970s. And Dubrovko-Justick has a two-box physical biological model that looks at the oxygen concentration below the picnic line, and you can see that presently it dips below 2 fairly often, but historically it did not. So there's a lot of evidence that things have changed, either from real data, paleo indicators, or from modeling exercises. So as Don said, you keep pushing back these things that aren't really relevant, and you come up with the basics that the fertilizer applications that are making the land so green and so productive are also getting down into the Gulf of Mexico, fueling phytoplankton growth. The flux of that carbon leads to respiration by bacteria, and the oxygen becomes lower and lower. So to get back to this scheme of where we are in this process, well, all of these scientific evidence now in the peer-reviewed literature has put us into management needs are now more known, and we're hoping that this directed research can end up in some sort of an implementation for nutrient mitigation. Now, when we first started this work, a few people knew about it. In 1993, when the size of the low oxygen doubled from the previous 7 years because of the Mississippi River flood that year, we're having another one this year, I sent out my first press release, which was a map and a statement about the size and what caused it. And it got a little flurry of attention, but people started waiting for the size. So in 1994, it was actually a normal flow year, but still as large of a hypoxic area. So I sent out another one, and this one ended up 2 inches above the fold on Sunday in the Washington Post. And that caught the eye, of course, Senator Breaux and a lot of other people, and he started saying that there needs to be more done, and officials at EPA and NOAA were also on board to start trying to make a difference on this. So that's when we took our road show to Davenport, Iowa. We started having meetings. There was a call for a general management conference. It was denied, so we were going to educate the public to solve this problem. So we had the farming community come to New Orleans in 1994, and a lot of people from USGS were also there and verified a lot of the things that we'd been publishing, which we were being said was not correct. And then we went to Davenport, the science end with the effects and the nutrients and the low oxygen. And there were more presentations by the agricultural community, of course, at that time. So the day of our science, everybody was polite and nice, and And then when the ag people gave all of their talks, they were just like rip roaring, woo, yeah, And then there was this upstart aquatic scientist named John Downing who was at that meeting, who kind of did like a summary of everything towards the end, and he was kind of questioning some of the things that we were presenting. But within 3 years, he was the chairman of a Council on Agricultural Science and Technology task force to look at hypoxia in the Gulf of Mexico, and I think based on the work that he's doing now, he definitely knows the relationships that we were talking about. Had to tell that, John. So then, as NOAA and EPA got more interested, there was a federal-state working group, which was later turned into a task force that called for finding out more about the issue. And there was also the passage of the Harmful Algal Bloom and Hypoxia Research and Control Act of 1998, which called for an assessment, but it was already in progress. So there were 6 studies that were done, really in-depth studies, peer-reviewed, that led to this integrated assessment and eventually an action plan for reducing, mitigating, and controlling hypoxia in the northern Gulf of Mexico. So the first was the assessment, which was finished in the year 2000, and then came the action plan that went into President Clinton's office early in January. And the goals were to reduce, primarily to make everybody happy in the Gulf and in the watershed, have good economics and good living resources, but also to reduce the size of the hypoxia to this 5,000 square kilometers, running average over 5 years. And Don Scavia, of course, knows the details of all this, but in those meetings, it was a knockdown, drag-out to get all of the states to agree and the federal agencies to agree to sign this. And rather than have a goal of 30% nitrate reduction, the goal became an environmental goal, and then everybody was okay with signing it. Not everybody is okay with signing the next one, which is going to be signed next Monday in New Orleans. At that time, 30% was thought was what was needed to reach 5,000 square kilometers, and based on all these other modeling efforts, it's really obvious that it's closer to 35 to 45% of the current nitrate load would have to be reduced. So with all good management, adaptive management plans, it called for a 5-year assessment. Not a whole lot had been done since 2001. It sat in the president's office for a year until Christine Todd Whitman, who was the former governor of the state of New Jersey, became the EPA administrator. And at a meeting that I co-chaired with National Academy and SCORE, National Academy and ERF, she gave the welcoming address and very sternly told the audience, without maybe looking at me too much, that she was really tired of this thing being equated to the size of the state of New Jersey. And she would really like for us to pick on somebody else like Rhode Island and Connecticut. So she knew, and within that year, by the end of that year, the task force was reconstituted, because I did happen to walk into her somewhere. Hi, Nancy Rabalais, remember Dead Zone, New Jersey? So she knew what was going on, and she cared. And so it was reconstituted. There hasn't been a whole lot of action in the action plan since 2001, but we did have that reassessment that started in 2006, and now in 2008, it might become final. So 5 years, 1 year sitting on a desk, 4 years of little action, and 2.5 years of assessment. But this new assessment done by the EPA Science Advisory Board supports the coastal goal and strongly supported all of the research that had already been done and all of the subsequent research, because we didn't stop in 2001 doing our research. We continue to publish papers. But to not only reduce nitrogen, but also phosphorus, it had never been ignored, but it wasn't the primary limiting nutrient. But there are indications of phosphorus and silica limitation on the shelf at times. The farm community started bringing phosphorus up as a major issue, and they said that most of it came from wastewater treatment plants, which it does not. So now it's to target nitrogen and phosphorus with the most effective, cost-effective, without disturbing the economy, all those words, but to work on, to target this time, not just to say, okay, we're going to do it everywhere, but we know where it's coming from and we know what we can do. And we knew where it was coming from before. Don Goolsbee did one of those reports, 1999, and Alexander and others just published a paper in Environmental Science and Technology, and the information is on the website. And you can see very clearly by their methodology, which uses a sparrow model, that most of the nitrogen comes from agricultural activities, a fairly large amount from atmospheric deposition, but that's ammonium volatilizing and then coming back down as ammonia on the land very close to it. And the NOx that gets produced actually travels a further distance. So there's some in the Ohio, but we're also dumping a lot of it in Narragansett Bay and Chesapeake Bay, and so you can thank the Ohio River Valley for that. You can also see that as far as the phosphorus is concerned, only 12% of urban sources were determined by this study. So it's still non-point source, primarily agriculture, and things can be done on all aspects, but the SAB supported some targeting of specific measures. This report by Alexander also updated the areas of high yield of both nitrogen and phosphorus, and you can see those areas here. The figures look very similar to the Goolsbee 99 report. They also broke up the states into their percent share, and over 50% of the nutrients come from 9 states, which the Times-Picayune in New Orleans dubbed the nutrient 9. I didn't do it, they did it. So besides the reddish colors on here, the other ones for phosphorus, Ohio, and then both of them for the state of Mississippi as well. The lower Mississippi River used to have wonderful bottomland hardwood forests and a floodplain that was effective, but now that doesn't exist anymore. And also the landscape has been changed. Most of the virgin forests have been lost. There's substantial erosion in places like Tennessee, where this picture was taken. We've lost most of the wetlands in the basin and the floodplain. The further south you go, more and more of it's behind a levee and not functioning as a natural floodplain. All of these changes to the landscape, however, predated the increase in the nitrate concentrations, which is almost a 1-to-1 correlation with the amount of fertilizers used in the watershed. So how are we going to do this, especially now that we're using more and more ethanol, or we want to, and there's more and more cropland and more fertilizers. And Corn Chip Boy here is really worried about this because he wants his corn chips. And he says, can I win for losing? Well, I don't think this is one of these win-win situations. The other report that was done was by Bill Mitch and Company, and they looked at ways to reduce nitrogen. And of course, there are lots of best management practices that can be done in the watershed. Riparian buffer strips, rebuilding wetlands, these are much more expensive to do, but the cost gets capitalized over many more years, and it's still effective many more years. Tertiary treatment can reduce some. It's also very expensive, and it's really only put into effect in water plants in cities where the nitrate is over the drinking water level. And some could possibly be diverted through coastal Louisiana. There's a big push for sustainable agriculture in the Midwest. Hopefully these groups will become more and more effective. But you can see the root structure of a wheat plant and the root structure of a blue stem, and you can see how much less nitrogen comes off of the landscape under these sustained and deep-rooted sorts of crops and versus the others. So if you put all this together, the relative reduction of nitrogen that can be done, of course, mostly in agricultural activities, all of these right here, and then very little in tertiary, wetlands and riparian, and then possibly some effect with coastal diversions in Louisiana. But, as I mentioned, we're having more and more corn crops and more fertilizer use. So these are data from Gene Turner, from his data set and others. He actually does biweekly sampling in Baton Rouge, and right now they're doing it weekly. They've been doing it weekly all this year. But the concentration of the nitrate now in the river is much higher than it's been historically. So there's more nitrogen per volume now than ever before. And 2007, there was a 12% increase in in corn. The high values continued into the fall and December, and actually the 2008 values were up here until we had the flood, and it's been diluted out somewhat. But the increase in the amount of cropland in corn did not result in, but was very closely associated or similar to the increase in the size of the low oxygen zone in 2007. It was predicted to be about 22.5, and it came out 20,500, and that's because when we got into this area, the shallower area, there was a low pressure system up from Mexico, kicked up the waves and winds, and you could see the picnic line go closer and closer to the bottom as we moved more to the west, so that the hypoxia was disrupted in these shallow areas, not in the deeper areas. And you can just see how big it is. It's huge. So what's happened over the years with all this higher concentration of nitrogen is that for the same amount of nitrate loading now, you can get a much larger area of hypoxia than historically. So we're in a shift here. We're in a paradigm shift, and it's going to be harder and harder to bring this back under control the further we go along this route. And of course, we found out that biofuels, many of us knew this before, but more and more people are deciding that biofuels aren't the answer for everything, including the National Research Council. But wait, biofuels might not be any good anymore. Well, it's too late, because I'm filling up with it, and the U.S. government is providing subsidies for this. And the very bottom, in case you can't see it, don't you care about the science? And this guy is right here, and he says, guess. So we run up against this all the time when we're trying to develop policy. There's a lot of economics involved that drive things maybe a whole lot more than the science, but we don't give up. So right now we're developing the hypoxia action plan for 2008, and we have all the same players and stakeholders and wanting things to be their way, or not giving in, or thinking about the common good and things like that. But this action plan will be signed on Monday in the historic New Orleans collection in New Orleans, and it's going to be a big deal. And I just hope that it takes a little more traction. However, some of the press is not very happy with the no action plan, saying that if you go ahead and do this, and you do what the action plan states, that you have until 2013 to come up with good plans in your states to reduce the nutrients, that means you've got 2 years to get the size of this low oxygen zone down, any at all. And given the vagaries of climate and the increase in biofuels, actually I told Don earlier, I really need to live 200 years to see if there's anything going on. And of course this year, we've had a major flood. The period in May, which Turner uses in his model, which is pretty accurate, he didn't depend on the great guru here. He actually did an estimate, and again, because we said it last year, it's going to be the largest ever. At some point, this shelf is going to run out of room because of the bathymetry and the physics, but I think there's still plenty of room for more hypoxia on this shelf. And on July 21st, if you want to pay $5,000 to go out with me, that's when I'll be leaving on my cruise. Not all is lost. There's a lot of places where improvements have been made in nutrient management and the relief of hypoxia. These are usually in areas where wastewater treatment can be controlled, not necessarily with non-point, but there have been some success stories. There's also what is considered a global epidemic of these hypoxic areas around the world. A paper coming out in Science pretty soon puts the number over 400, with other areas becoming of concern. And it follows our human footprint on the earth. And if you had this map 10 years ago, you wouldn't see many of these red dots in Southeast Asia. And now you do. And so our desire for high standard of living, industrialization, cars, fertilized agribusiness, it's just moving around in its location around the world. So we expect to have many more of these becoming apparent. What does the future hold for us? Well, given my 200 years that I'm going to need to see what happens, I would predict there's going to be some effects of climate change, aggravation of rainfall, frequency of hurricanes is or is not, and the severity is or is not going to change depending on which week of science you're reading. But that would have an effect re-aerating, but it's also disastrous for the coastal zone. And people will continue to add to the population, agribusiness will spread, and there will be more fossil fuel or ethanol burning that can contribute to atmospheric deposition. So I didn't want you to think this is all hard work. I've had the great honor and privilege to work with so many people over the years. Some of them are shown here. We really don't have fun. This is the only one who gets to have fun on the cruises. But I just wanted to let you know who some of the funders were and thank all the people here in the audience who know me and have been supported through the years, the nominating committee, and of course ASLO for this Ruth Patrick Award. Thank you very much. So now John Downing is going to answer all of my questions.
That's great. No,
Yeah, I'll take questions. I don't know how long I took. I felt like I took too long.
How deep is the pycnocline in the area?
It's about 10 meters. That's usually where the pycnocline is. The salinity, well, you can have a salinity pycnocline at 5 meters, and you might have another temperature pycnocline at 15 meters sometimes, but the average is about 10 meters. I can't see. Now I know what it's like. Are any of those people in the audience here who know what those people said about me behind closed doors? Because I want to see you later.
What's the value of the ecosystem goods and services that can be foregone in the hypoxia zone? And is that calculation of any use in the second part of your activities, that is, influencing decision-making of agricultural land use?
Right. One of the reports that was done in 1999 was by Otto Düring, who was going to look at the cost-benefit analysis, but it was difficult to come up with the benefits. He could come up with the costs of doing things pretty easily, but it was hard to come up with the benefits. We still have a very productive fishery in Louisiana. We just don't know where we are on that curve, that continuum of increased production and then decreased production with increased nutrient enrichment. And there's been no analysis of ecosystem services and those benefits, and so that is something that needs to be done, definitely. And it's hard to get economics on the fishery as well because of too many boats in the fleet, the cost of fuel. Do they just stay home? They don't go shrimping anymore. I know that's the case right now. I know a lot of recreational fishers are not going offshore anymore because of the cost of fuel, because they have to go further to get the catch that they want. And there's so many things tied in here. The wetlands are very important, and we are losing wetlands as nursery areas. The river, when it's in flood, we're more likely to have hypoxia, but it's also reduces the salinity in the nursery area, which is less preferable for the brown shrimp. And if we have a drought, the salinity goes up in the surface area, it's less likely to have hypoxia offshore, and you have a better brown shrimp catch. So there are a lot of confounded things that you can't really separate to get to the, not the true causes, but it's a series of things that happen. Yes. Yes.
The problem we have in the Midwest, the states that you had outlined there, Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, so much of it is tile drains.
Yes.
And it's going to be really hard to keep the nitrate from flowing through there.
Yes. I was at a meeting of agricultural drainage experts to give the hypoxia talk, and we've had a couple of these. Don Bosch had this, a similar group meeting in the Chesapeake Bay. They basically said, don't touch my tile drains. But there's a lot of experimentation going on right now with ag extension agents and with universities to see how they can be changed, how the flow can be changed, how you can make some, you can carbon enrich in a, like a semi little wetland to remove some of the nutrients before they move through. But Richard Alexander in another paper in Nature showed that the size of the stream, the smaller the size of the stream, the more removal of nitrogen. And once you get into the larger streams, there's very little transformation, and it just shoots right through. Right. I have another slide that has molecules called nitrollers with dollar marks over them that I had left out because I knew this was going to be long anyway. But when I started talking to the agricultural community, I said, well, just use less nitrogen. Well, it's their insurance. If you over-fertilize, then at some point you're going to get a bumper crop, and that part of the farm budget was minuscule at that time. With the cost of natural gas going up, it's becoming more expensive to buy fertilizer, but it's still cost-effective to put on more than necessary. I'd say, okay, well, put it on some other time. Don't put it on in the winter. Well, the winter is when they have the equipment available and the soil is okay, and they can't wait till spring. And I kept coming up with some of these same questions, and there's a very consistent way of doing row crops, the corn soybean rotation, that's pretty set.
There's a question back there. If you could reduce the ag load, what sort of time lag would you expect before you got sort of a response in the Gulf?
Okay.
Have you told farmers?
Well, one of the things with any action plan or any goal is that if you make a change somewhere, you expect to see an immediate response in the system. There's still going to remain a lot of nitrogen in the system, even if the fertilizers are cut back. That's still going to get to the Gulf. In the Gulf, there's still carbon accumulated in the sediments and some of these nutrients that can still be regenerated, so there is going to be a time lag. The perfect example of how long it would take is the continental shelf of the northwest part of the Black Sea, which receives the effluent of the Danube, which has the same trajectory as the Mississippi River. The nutrients were going up and the low oxygen area was getting larger and larger, up to 44,000 square kilometers. Collapse of the Soviet Union, no more subsidies for fertilizer, the nitrate and phosphorus loads crashed, and within about 6 years or so, there was no more hypoxia on the shelf. That's an economic disaster. That's not a preferred way of reducing the loads of nitrogen and phosphorus. Yeah. And, the cost of fuel is going to drive a lot of this as well. It's going to drive a lot of environmental issues and economy. Okay. Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and don't forget the lobster dinner and just down the street.